Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to update and talk about trends in board compensation. And joining me is Chris Havey, who's a partner with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome back, Chris.
Thank you, TK. Pleasure to be here.
So let's first talk about the current situation with respect to director compensation. I know the pandemic has had there were some companies that actually altered their board pay to sort of fit in with what management was doing. But give us a review of sort of the last 6 months and what you've seen.
Yeah, that's right, TK. During the pandemic, I think there was a lot of boards that wanted to show solidarity with management. And so, management took a pay cut, the boards took a pay cut as well. Usually on the cash retainer, but in most cases those have been restored as the pandemic waned, or at least came down from the high point. But then even outside of that, there were companies that maybe wanted to make they were behind on the market, or they felt like they should make a change to director comp, but they held off because they weren't sure about kind of the broader economy and how that might be perceived externally. And now that the pandemic has really started to wane and the economy's recovered and we're back into a potentially inflationary environment, I think directors are relooking at the pay programs and saying, okay, do we need to make changes that we've maybe held off for the last couple of years on? And so now we're seeing some companies that have, not made changes for a couple of years. They were behind the market, or the market has moved a little bit, and so they're making changes now. So we've seen quite a few companies make changes. They aren't substantial, but make increases that they haven't made in the last couple of years. And so we're expecting the market data to increase a bit because of those changes that have kind of been on hold for the last couple of years.
Yeah. So when we look at director pay, again, there's never been what I call maybe wholesale changes. But here's a two-part question for you. First, what trends do you sort of see when you look down the road a little bit? And part two of that is, and this was probably the biggest change, is when there was a lot of shareholder pressure on the balance between fees and equity. There was a push by investors to make sure that directors were in a similar position to shareholders. At the same time, this is just my personal views, but I thought that pendulum might have swung a little far. Because you had people focusing on share price rather than their oversight duties, right. Because they had some boards had significant holdings with that. So two-part question, trends, and then do you see any change in the balance between fees and equity?
Well, I'll take that second one first. I think there has been a continued shift towards equity compensation within the director program. The weighting has shifted from, maybe it was less than 50-50, or it was around 50-50, to now it's maybe 60-40, or maybe even higher depending on your industry or your peer group, higher weighting on equity. And I don't know that we'll see a shift back, but I think we might see some tapering off on that, because I don't think you can have the equity package get too high as a percentage of the total package. Now, there are still some industries or some companies that want to have a very high focus on equity weighting, and that's great. But I think on balance, we might see a little bit of a tapering off on that continued shift towards equity. And part of the reason for that, and this gets into the other trends, is one of the big drivers of, I think, trends right now is ESG, director diversity, board diversity, and that has a couple implications for director compensation that we've heard about or we've seen. One is making sure the comp program is inclusive, and inclusive of a broader audience, filling the director role. And so that means a couple things. One, not everybody's going to be a former CEO that's going to be on the board and have that be independently wealthy. And so there's an opportunity to maybe take a step back and say, well, is the mix of cash and equity, do we have enough cash comp to bring people on so that they can pay their taxes on their equity compensation that's vesting? And maybe have a little bit of change on the side after that. So that, I think that's one aspect of it. I think the other piece of it, we saw a lot of companies in the past that have had like mandatory deferrals until retirement on their equity, where you can't get the equity until you leave the board. Well, that again is not super inclusive to individuals that might not be independently wealthy, and you maybe want a different kind of candidate coming in. So I think I've seen a few companies that have taken those programs out where they had a mandatory deferral of equity. They've taken that out, and part of the rationale has been trying to be more inclusive and attract more diverse director sets. So I think those are a couple trends. I think one more that we've seen is, again, ESG and board diversity is kind of the impact on the committee chairs and the committee relationships and their responsibility. So a lot of the focus on attracting new directors and attracting a diverse set of directors and bringing new directors on board. The focus on the company's ESG and the board's oversight of ESG issues at the company. A lot of those fall under the nomination and governance committee, or however you call that. And so if we go back, back to Sarbanes-Oxley, the audit committee chair after Sarbanes-Oxley got a kind of a premium retainer because of all the requirements around Sarbanes-Oxley. And then when we had say on pay out of Dodd-Frank, we saw the comp committee chair get a kind of a premium retainer for that. And now it's ESG is the new trend, and these are like every 10 years, I guess. ESG is the new trend, and we're having a greater focus potentially on the nomination and governance committee because of that. And so I think we might see more of an evening out of those committee chair retainers, so that audit and comp and nom-gov might be actually fairly well similar, or maybe there's not as much differentiation as there has in the past. That won't work for every company, but I think we're going to see greater examples of that within the industry.
So now all we need to do is see the non-executive chair compensation sort of balance out closer to the executive chair, because there's a big discrepancy, if I remember.
There is, and lead director as well. I mean, I think there's a lot of reevaluation of the roles and why compensation is paid the way that it is. And I think that's certainly playing a role with the chairs, with the committee chairs. I think it's wait to see if that plays into the lead director and the non-executive chair roles as well.
Yeah, we oversee a community of next gen directors, and your point about the fees and covering taxes. These people are mid-career and don't have the wealth that most directors have. And if you want a younger director, you got to have those fees enough to, certainly make them whole and make sure that, it's not a burden for younger mid-career directors. So right. That's a great point. So let me talk about one other thing. Ever since the Delaware courts sort of dinged a couple companies on director pay, on it being excessive, everybody has been pretty much in line and is very sensitive to what their peer group is as far as director pay. Nobody wants to sort of be singled out as being too greedy on with the directors having that power to set their own, pay level. But right. At the same time, when I see the workloads that directors have, with all the new disclosures, all the pressure about workforces and human capital and ESG, you name it, it's difficult for me to say sort of what is the balance, what is fair, compensation. So what would you say to companies if they ask you, so how do you go about the process of determining what is fair for the amount of work that's involved?
Right. And it's not just the Delaware case. I think it's also ISS has targeted some excessive director pay as well. If you look at the Delaware case, I think one of the big drivers, one of the big actions that companies have taken away from that is setting limits and working those limits into their equity plans on either total director pay or equity, or the equity compensation that's paid to directors. So I think that's one other trend that we've seen that's almost universal now. But I think the ISS one, they're going after the top 2% in your industry or your sector or whatever for your size group. So again, both of those are about, even the Delaware case, those were extreme kind of outlier practices. ISS is going after kind of outlier practices. And so what's happened is as you pointed out, there's almost a tightening of the pay practices within a peer group or within whatever your comparison group you're comparing against. And so there's a very tight range to play within. But I think that range is moving up. I think the market data, as we talked about before, it's been fairly flat for a couple of years, but I think we're going to start to see it move up. I think that gives companies an opportunity to say, okay, are we maintaining competitiveness? Are we able to attract and bring directors into our board? Is the comp program, helping or hindering that? So I think it allows companies to answer or to ask themselves that question and to come up with relevant answers. I do think that we will continue to see companies when we evaluate pay, we want to stay within a reasonable range. We don't want to be outliers, but I think there's still room within that range to increase. And I think what most of my clients do is they don't increase it every year. This isn't like executive pay where you have a merit increase or broad-based pay where you have a merit increase every year. They take larger chunks and they say, well, now we've fallen behind, and so we haven't changed it for a couple of years, and so we'll move up a little bit above the median so that we can have room so that we don't have to change it for another couple of years again. So they kind of do it more in chunks, and we're going to see, I think we'll continue to see chunks of movements, and every company will be doing the same thing. We'll continue to see upward movement, I think, because of that.
Well, no question that directors are, have more work. So it's hard to argue that the compensation shouldn't follow, at least in some ways. So, Chris, this is great information, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us and sort of bring us up to date on director pay. So thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.